They erased me from the family will and said, "You were never really one of us." I still hear those words every time I close my eyes. That day, I was standing outside my father's lawyer's office, the cold air stinging my face harder than the truth I'd just heard. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, like he wished he could disappear. But the real sting came from the two people sitting across the room, Grant and Marlo Whitman, my step-siblings. Grant leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that smug little smile I always hated curling on his lips. "Guess blood really does matter," he said. Marlo laughed softly, brushing her perfect blonde hair from her shoulder. "You were never really one of us, Alara," she added. "It's better this way." Better for who? I wanted to ask, but the words stuck in my throat. I just nodded, keeping my face still. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. The lawyer kept explaining something about legal clauses and my name not being included, but I didn't hear a thing. My ears buzzed and the room felt too small. I stepped outside into the parking lot, the sun bright and cruel. The air smelled like asphalt and exhaust. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, trying to stop my chest from hurting. My father, no, my stepfather, had raised me since I was 8. My mom died young, and he promised to take care of me like his own. For years, I believed him. I believed we were a family. But maybe that was my mistake. I remembered the little moments that suddenly made sense now. The Christmas when Grant got the new bike, and I got socks. The time my graduation photo went missing from the living room wall. The quiet looks between them when I called him Dad. All those tiny cracks I ignored because I wanted to belong so badly. When Mom was alive, she used to tell me, "Love makes a family, not blood." I held on to that like it was truth. But standing there in front of the lawyer's office, watching Grant drive away in the car my stepfather left him, I realized love wasn't enough, not for them. I walked to my own old car, the one I bought secondhand after years of saving. My reflection in the window looked strange, like I didn't know the woman staring back. Something inside me had changed. The part of me that kept hoping for their approval was gone. What was left was quiet, heavy but sharp. They thought they had erased me, that I'd walk away and disappear. Maybe they didn't know me as well as they thought. Because I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I turned the key in the ignition and drove off, the road stretching out in front of me. I didn't know where I was going yet. But I knew one thing for sure. This was not the end of my story. I packed my things slowly, trying not to think about how quiet the house felt. There wasn't much that belonged to me anyway. A few shirts, an old coat, my mother's locket, and a box of letters she had written before she died. That was all I had left of her, and of the life I thought I had here. Grant and Marlo didn't say a word while I carried my boxes to the car. They stayed inside, pretending not to notice. I guess it was easier for them that way. When I closed the car door and looked at the house one last time, it didn't even feel like home anymore. The windows looked cold, the garden overgrown. Every memory that used to make me smile now felt heavy. I started the engine and drove until the road signs changed and the name, Whitman, wasn't anywhere to be seen. I ended up in a small town called Harlow Creek. It wasn't much, just a few diners, a gas station, and streets lined with old oaks. I rented a tiny room above a bakery. The walls were thin, and the smell of bread woke me every morning, but it was cheap and quiet. I got a job at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering lights and a coffee pot that never emptied. The first few weeks were hard. I worked long shifts, wiping tables, refilling cups, and pretending to smile. The tips were small, but I didn't complain. I didn't want anyone to feel sorry for me. At night, when I got back to my room, I would take out my mother's locket and hold it in my hand. It was scratched and dull, but when I opened it, her picture still smiled at me like nothing had changed. Sleep never came easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grant's smirk, heard Marlo's soft laugh, and the lawyer's quiet voice saying my name wasn't in the will. I kept asking myself why I didn't see it sooner. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I believed too much in something that was never real. One night, I pulled out a notebook from my bag. I wrote proof on the cover in big letters. Then I started writing everything I could remember. The times they left me out, the words they said, the moments that showed I was never part of their world. It wasn't to get pity. It was to remind myself that what they did was real. That I hadn't imagined it. Each page made me feel lighter, even when the words hurt. I realized they hadn't just erased me from the will. They'd been erasing me slowly for years. Every photo that went missing, every time my name was left out of a story, every accident, that pushed me further away. But now, in that little town with nothing but my own hands to build from, I was no longer their ghost. I was beginning to exist again, piece by piece, word by word. Months passed, and life in Harlow Creek fell into a quiet routine. I worked my morning shift at the diner, came home smelling like coffee and fried eggs, and tried not to think about the Whitmans. But one afternoon, as I was locking up after my shift, I saw a familiar face, Mrs. Holloway, our old neighbor from back home. She was just passing through town and recognized me right away. "Ilara," she said, eyes wide. "I almost didn't believe it was you. My goodness, child, it's been so long." We sat at a corner booth, and she told me about the town, the gossip, and then, without realizing it, she mentioned my old family. "The Whitmans aren't doing so well," she said quietly. "Your stepfather's company is falling apart since he passed. Those kids of his, Grant and Marlowe, they don't know what they're doing." Her words stayed with me long after she left. I walked home slowly that evening, the cool wind biting at my face, but my thoughts were burning. For so long, I'd imagined them living comfortably, sitting in that big house, running the business they stole from me. Now, to hear they were failing, it stirred something inside me. Not joy exactly, but a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I didn't just feel hurt. I felt awake. That night, I sat at my small kitchen table and stared at the notebook labeled Proof. All the anger I had poured into it had done nothing but sit there, trapped in ink. If I wanted real justice, I couldn't just write about it. I had to move. I had to learn. I had to build something smarter than them. So I picked up my laptop and searched for community college courses. I found night classes for business management and accounting. I didn't have much money, but I signed up anyway. I told myself I'd find a way to make it work. The next morning, I asked my boss at the diner for more hours, but he didn't have any to give. So I found a second job at a small supply store down the street, stocking shelves in the evenings before class. My body ached, my feet throbbed, but every time I looked at my notebook, I remembered why I was doing it. Weeks turned into months. I learned about budgets, contracts, and how companies rise and fall. The more I studied, the clearer it became Grant and Marlowe had no idea what they were doing back at Whitman and Sons. They were running the company like spoiled children playing with matches. Each night, when I came home from class, I'd sit by the window with my mother's locket in hand and whisper to myself, "This isn't revenge. This is preparation." I started saving every dollar I could, eating simply, cutting out anything unnecessary. Little by little, I began to feel control returning to my life. I didn't need to shout or fight or beg them to see my worth. I was going to show them by becoming everything they said I couldn't be. 3 years passed before I saw that town again. It looked the same gray streets, the same mill by the river, but I wasn't the same woman who had left. The girl who drove away crying was gone. The one who came back had a plan. I wasn't Ilara Whitman anymore. I used my mother's maiden name now, Ilara Monroe. It felt right, like I was finally standing on my own. Under that name, I started a small company through a holding firm, quiet and clean, nothing that drew attention. Then I bought a piece of land right next to the Whitman mill. It was overgrown, forgotten, and cheap. Exactly what I needed. No one recognized me. Time and distance had reshaped me. My hair was darker, my clothes sharper, my voice steadier. When I spoke, people listened. When I walked into a room, I wasn't that shy girl waiting for approval anymore. I had learned that power doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being prepared. The Whitman mill didn't look like it used to. The paint was peeling, and the trucks came in less often. Rumors spread through town that the business was falling apart. Workers were being laid off with no warning. Families were struggling to make ends meet. I listened carefully and I took notes. One by one, I started reaching out to the laid-off workers. I met them at the diner, the hardware store, the small bar by the river. I told them that my company, Monroe Timberworks, was hiring. I didn't make big promises, just honest ones. I said they'd get fair pay, regular hours, and respect. That was enough. Within weeks, men and women who had once worked for the Whitmans started showing up to work for me. They called me Miss Monroe out of habit and respect. I never corrected them. I treated them like I wished someone had treated me, with patience, kindness, and trust. They didn't know who I really was, and I didn't tell them. When they talked about the Whitmans, about the long hours and unpaid overtime, I just listened. I heard every story, every complaint, every moment of unfairness. Their words fueled me, but I never let it show. I only nodded and said, "We'll do things differently here." And we did. The yard filled with the sound of saws and laughter instead of shouting. Workers went home proud instead of exhausted. Every paycheck I signed felt like a small step towards something bigger, a quiet justice. From my office window, I could see the Whitman Mill across the river. It looked smaller than I remembered, weaker somehow. Sometimes I'd catch sight of Grant pacing outside, talking on the phone, frustration written all over his face. He still had no idea who I was. That thought made me smile, not out of cruelty, but out of calm satisfaction. They had erased me once, but I had written myself back into their world. Only this time, I was the one holding the pen. Monroe Timberworks opened quietly, without any big signs or speeches. I didn't need attention. All I wanted was to build something steady and fair. My workers showed up early, proud to have jobs they could count on. The machines started humming before sunrise, the smell of fresh cut wood filling the air. I paid everyone on time, listened when they spoke, and made sure safety came first. People in town noticed. Word spread fast about the new lumber company that treated its workers right. At first, the Whitmans didn't take it seriously. Grant thought Monroe Timberworks was just another small business that would disappear in a few months. But when Monroe Timberworks started winning contracts they thought were theirs, the whispers began. Clients who had worked with the Whitmans for years started choosing me instead. They liked my prices, my honesty, and how my company kept every promise. I didn't have to do anything loud or cruel. The truth did the work for me. My company grew because I ran it with the kind of respect they never showed anyone. Slowly, the town began to turn. People talked in diners, stores, and even at church. They said the Whitmans were slipping, that the new company across the river was doing better business. That Miss Monroe was someone to watch. From my office window, I could see the Whitman Mill. It looked tired now, like an old dog that had been running too long. Trucks came less often, and some days the gates didn't even open. I heard from my workers, many of whom had friends or family still over there, that Grant was furious. He yelled at everyone, threw things, and blamed the drop in profits on bad luck. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from a local supplier. He told me Grant and Marlowe had gotten into a fight in front of their employees. Grant accused her of leaking company secrets, saying someone must have told Monroe Timberworks about their contracts. Marlowe denied it, of course, but their voices carried through the whole building. Everyone knew the partnership was falling apart. I didn't feel joy. Not exactly. But there was a quiet, cold satisfaction in knowing that the people who had once laughed at me were now tearing each other down. It wasn't my doing, they were destroying themselves. I had just given them a mirror to see what they truly were. That evening, I stood by my window with a cup of coffee in my hand. The lights from the Whitman Mill flickered weakly in the distance. I watched for a long time, the steam from my cup curling into the air. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just watched. The sweetest kind of revenge isn't loud or cruel. It's calm. It's patient. It's watching the people who broke you crumble under the weight of what they built with lies, and knowing you didn't have to lift a single finger to make it happen. The story started spreading faster than I expected. A journalist from a local paper wrote a piece called The Downfall of Whitman and Sons. It talked about how the once powerful family business was losing contracts, facing lawsuits, and laying off workers. My company, Monroe Timberworks, was mentioned as their biggest new competitor. The article called me the quiet storm in the lumber industry, and I almost laughed when I read that. If only they knew. Still, no one made the connection. No one realized that Alara Monroe was once Alara Whitman, the girl they had erased. I kept my head down, stayed polite with the press, and turned down every request for interviews. I didn't need fame. I only needed the Whitmans to feel the same emptiness they had left in me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against my window, soft but steady. I sat up and stared at the article again. My name printed there didn't even feel like mine anymore. It belonged to someone else, someone I had built from pieces of pain and patience. I felt proud, but also heavy. Success hadn't erased the memories. If anything, it made them louder. I drove out to the cemetery after midnight, when the roads were empty and the world was quiet. The headlights cut through the fog as I parked near the old oak tree at the edge of the graveyard. My father's headstone stood where it always had, worn and gray, surrounded by uncut grass. I hadn't been there in years. I stood in front of it, unsure what to say at first. For a long moment, I just stared at the carved name, Thomas Whitman. My voice came out low and shaky. "I'm not doing this for money, Dad," I whispered. "I'm doing it because they erased me. The rain started again, thin and cold, but I didn't move. My hands were trembling. I tried to be good to them. I tried to be family. But they made me disappear like I never existed. I just need them to remember who I am. My throat burned as I spoke. The tears came before I could stop them, running warm against my cold skin. For years, I had trained myself not to cry, not to feel too much. But standing there, all the walls I'd built cracked open just a little. I reached out and brushed my fingers over the stone. "You'd hate what I'm doing," I said softly. "But you'd understand why." When I finally stepped back, the wind had died down. The rain had slowed to a mist. I took one last look at his grave before walking back to my car. I felt lighter somehow, like the storm inside me had shifted. By the time I reached the road, my tears had dried. My hands were steady again. Whatever guilt or sadness I had left didn't matter anymore. I wasn't finished, not yet. It happened on a gray morning when the clouds hung low over the town. I was in my office, going through invoices, when the door burst open so hard that it hit the wall. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. That kind of anger had a sound all its own. Grant Whitman stood in the doorway, his face red and tight, his jaw clenched like he was holding back a storm. He looked older, more worn than I remembered. The sharp suit couldn't hide the cracks in him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the machines outside. "You're behind this?" he finally said, voice shaking with rage. "You're the one who's been taking everything from us?" I leaned back in my chair and met his eyes. "Hello, Grant," I said calmly. "It's been a while." He stepped closer, slamming a folder down on my desk. "Elara Monroe," he said bitterly. "What a nice name. Hiding behind your mother's ghost, huh? You think this is funny?" I glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. "You told me I wasn't one of you," I said quietly. "So I built something of my own." His laugh was harsh and ugly. "You think this makes you powerful? You think this little game, means anything? I can ruin you. I'll sue you into the ground." I smiled just a little. "You can try," I said, "but you'll find that your company doesn't have much ground left." He blinked, confused, then frowned. "What are you talking about?" I opened a drawer and slid a document across the desk toward him. "That property your mill sits on," I said evenly. "It doesn't actually belong to Whitman and Sons anymore. You've been leasing it for the past 6 months from a holding company." Grant's face went pale as he scanned the page. "No," he muttered. "That can't be right." "It's right," I said. "And the holding company belongs to me." He stared at me, speechless. The silence stretched between us until it felt heavy enough to break. I could see it, the moment he realized how deep my plan had gone. How careful I'd been. How he'd never even seen it coming. "You played us," he whispered finally. "All this time." I tilted my head slightly. "You erased me," I said. "I just learned how to write myself back in." For a moment, he looked like he might shout again, but instead, he just stood there, trembling, his pride crumbling faster than his company. He tried to collect the papers, his hands unsteady, but I reached over and pulled them back. "I'd keep those if I were you," I said softly. "They're the only proof you still have of what's left." Grant turned without another word and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. I sat there for a while, listening to the echo fade. Then I turned back to my work. His anger didn't scare me. It only told me one thing. The reveal had begun. The fall came faster than anyone expected. One morning, the news spread across town like wildfire. Whitman and Sons Timberworks was under federal investigation. No one knew where the information came from, but the rumors said an anonymous source had sent in documents showing years of tax fraud and fake bookkeeping. I already knew, of course. I had sent those documents myself. Every paper, every number, every hidden payment I had uncovered through quiet, careful work. I didn't do it out of rage anymore. I did it because they had built their power on lies, and it was time for the truth to speak louder than their name. The investigation tore through their company like fire through dry wood. Trucks stopped running, contracts were canceled, and their bank accounts were frozen overnight. Grant tried to hold press conferences, swearing it was all a mistake. Marlo looked lost beside him, her perfect smile gone. But no one believed them. The town that had once bowed to the Whitmans now whispered behind their backs. Within weeks, the company was done. Employees left, investors pulled out, and the mill that had once been their pride stood silent, its gates locked. The Whitman name, once painted in bold letters on every truck, became a joke, a warning of what greed could do. Then came the foreclosure notices. Their mansion, the one they had called home for generations, was listed for auction. I read the notice in the paper one morning while stirring my coffee. I felt no joy, no rush of victory. Just a deep, quiet calm. It was time to finish what I started. Through a different company name, one of my many holding firms, I placed a bid. No one questioned it. They didn't see my face, didn't hear my name. When the auction ended, the property was mine. Just like that. A few weeks later, I drove up the long driveway I once knew by heart. The gates were rusted, the garden overgrown, the fountain dry. The house looked smaller now, older. It didn't scare me anymore. I parked my car where Grant's used to sit and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The key turned easily in the lock. Inside, everything was dust and silence. I walked through the hallways, past the grand staircase, and the room where my mother's picture had once hung before they took it down. I touched the wall where my old bedroom door had been, now painted over. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they had stolen. In the study, I stood by the window and looked out toward the mill in the distance. It was dark, lifeless. For years, that view had reminded me of what I'd lost. Now it reminded me of what I had built. They had thrown me out of this house once, telling me I wasn't family. Now I owned it, and they had nothing. I didn't laugh, and I didn't cry. I just stood there quietly, knowing the past had finally come full circle. It was a cold evening when I heard the knock at the door. The sound echoed through the empty halls of the mansion, the same house they had once called theirs. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I took my time walking to the door. When I opened it, I froze for a moment. Grant and Marlowe stood on the front step, shivering from the cold. They didn't look like the proud Whitmans I used to know. Their clothes were wrinkled, their faces tired, their confidence gone. For a second, it felt strange seeing them like that, so small against the house that had once belonged to them. "Elara," Grant said, his voice low and rough. He didn't sound angry anymore, just beaten. We didn't know where else to go. I didn't answer. I just looked at them, waiting. The silence made Marlowe shift uncomfortably. She tried to smile, but it trembled and disappeared. "The bank took everything," she said softly. "The company, the cars, even the furniture. We don't have a place to stay." They both looked past me into the house. The warm light spilling from the hallway touched their faces. I could see the hope in their eyes, faint but desperate. Grant cleared his throat. "We just need a few days," he said. "Until we figure things out." I kept my hand on the door, steady and calm. "You have family in the next town," I said. "You should ask them." He shook his head. "They don't want to see us." He let out a bitter laugh. "Guess we finally learned what that feels like." Marlowe's eyes filled with tears. "Please, Elara. We made mistakes. We were wrong. But you don't have to." I stopped her with a small raise of my hand. "You don't have to explain," I said quietly. Grant stepped closer, his eyes flashing with anger again, just for a moment. "You wouldn't understand what it's like to lose everything," he said. For the first time, I smiled. It wasn't cruel, just small and calm. "Actually," I said softly, "I do." His face went blank, and for once he had nothing to say. Marlowe looked down at the porch, tears sliding down her cheeks. I took one last look at them. The people who had laughed as they erased my name from the will, the ones who told me I didn't belong. They stood there now, stripped of everything but regret. Slowly, I began to close the door. The hinges creaked, and the space between us grew smaller with every inch. Neither of them moved. They just stood there in silence. When the door finally clicked shut, I leaned against it for a moment, breathing deeply. I didn't feel angry anymore. Just still. Outside, their footsteps faded down the steps, swallowed by the wind. Inside, the house was quiet again. It was mine now, completely, finally. And for the first time, that silence felt right. The house took months to bring back to life. I hired local workers to fix the roof, paint the walls, and clear the overgrown garden. Every board, every nail felt like part of something being rebuilt. Not just the house, but me too. I didn't restore it to show off or to prove anything. I just wanted to close the last open door in my past. When the work was finally done, the house looked warm again. The cracked windows were replaced, the floors shined, and the old staircase no longer creaked. The rooms smelled of fresh paint and polished wood. It didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt quiet, peaceful. I moved my things in on a soft spring morning. The sun came through the curtains, lighting up the space that had once felt so cold. I walked through every room, touching the walls as I went, remembering how much pain had lived inside these walls. But now it was mine, not as a wound, but as something healed. While unpacking, I decided to hang a mirror in the hallway. When I lifted it, something small fell out from behind the frame, a faded photograph covered in dust. I knelt and picked it up carefully. It was a picture of my mother and my stepfather. She was smiling, holding my hand, and he was looking at us like we were his whole world. On the back of the photo, in his handwriting, were the words, "To my real daughter, family isn't blood, it's loyalty." For a moment, I couldn't move. My throat tightened and tears filled my eyes. All these years, I had wondered if he truly saw me as his daughter, or if I had only imagined it. Now I had my answer, written in his own hand. I sat on the floor, holding the photo close, feeling the weight of it in my palms. The anger, the hurt, the loneliness, all of it finally started to fade. I looked around the room, at the light streaming through the window, and whispered softly, "I finally bought my peace." The house was silent, but it felt alive, like it was listening. I placed the picture on the mantel, next to my mother's locket, and smiled. The past was no longer something that hurt. It was something I had survived. And at last it was over.